February 23rd, 1945. 10:20 in the morning. The summit of Mount Suribachi, Iwo Jima. The wind off the Pacific hits Sergeant Michael Strank before anything else. Cold and salt thick, cutting through a uniform that hasn't been dry in 4 days. Below him, the island stretches out like a clenched fist of black, volcanic rock. Somewhere in that rock, thousands of Japanese soldiers wait in tunnels they have spent months carving. Above him, nothing but sky. Strank is 25 years old, a Czech immigrant who grew up in Pennsylvania coal country. He enlisted before Pearl Harbor because he believed in something. Right now, what he believes in most is getting his 4 Marines off this volcano alive. He is carrying a piece of cloth. Iwo Jima is 8 square miles of sulfur and ash. It smells like rotten eggs. The sand is black. Nothing grows. Before February 1945, most Americans couldn't have found it on a map, and the men ordered to take it wished they couldn't find it either. But the island sat exactly halfway between the B-29 bases in the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland. American bombers flying those missions had no fighter cover. Crippled planes had nowhere to land. In the cold arithmetic of strategic planning, Iwo Jima had to fall. The Marines who hit the beaches on February 19th discovered something the pre-invasion bombing had failed to accomplish. The Japanese were still there, all 21,000 of them. Commander Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent months building 11 miles of tunnels connecting 1,500 fortified positions. His orders to his men were simple and terrible. Each soldier should kill 10 Americans before dying. Surrender was not a concept he recognized. In 4 days of fighting, the Marines had taken 6,000 casualties. They had advanced less than a mile. Mount Suribachi, time equals 3 milliseconds, the extinct volcano at the island's southern tip, had been watching over the carnage the entire time. From its summit, Japanese observers could direct artillery onto any point on the beach. Taking it was the first necessity. Taking it might also be the last thing many of them did. On the morning of February 23rd, a 40-man patrol from the 3rd Platoon, E Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines began climbing Suribachi. They expected resistance at every step. They found almost none. The Japanese defenders had withdrawn into the tunnels, waiting. At 10:02 a.m., they reached the summit crater. Lieutenant Harold Schreier had brought a small American flag taken from the deck of the USS Missoula. It measured 54 by 28 inches, small enough to carry in a pocket. His men lashed it to a piece of drainage pipe and drove it into the volcanic rock. Down on the beach, thousands of Marines who had spent 4 days dying looked up and saw it. The ships offshore saw it. A roar went up, spontaneous, animal, the sound of men who had begun to believe they might survive this. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, watching from offshore, turned to General Holland Smith. "The raising of that flag on Suribachi," he said, "means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." The Japanese, watching from their tunnels, opened fire. Colonel Chandler Johnson wanted to keep that first flag. He sent word up the mountain, "Find a bigger one." The flag coming down was going to him personally. What happened next was almost accidental in its composition. Sergeant Strank, Corporal Harlon Block, Private First Class Franklin Sousley, Private First Class Rene Gagnon, Private First Class Ira Hayes, and Navy Corpsman John Bradley gathered around a longer pole, a Japanese water pipe 20 feet long. They had a second flag, larger than the first, borrowed from a transport ship. Someone would later say it measured 96 by 56 inches, big enough to be seen from the beach. Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal had climbed Suribachi that morning on a hunch. He almost missed it. He had just set down his camera to build a small platform of rocks to stand on, when someone shouted that they were raising it now. He swung his speed graphic camera up. He didn't look through the viewfinder. Time equals 5 milliseconds. He just fired. The shutter opened for 1/400th of a second. In that fraction of time, 6 men were caught in an act of shared effort. Not posing, not performing, simply straining together against weight and wind to plant something in the earth. The image is all tension and purpose, bodies angled forward, arms outstretched, hands overlapping on the pole, faces invisible. They are less individuals than a single organism reaching upward. Rosenthal didn't know what he had. He sent the film out with a courier and went back to covering the war. Time equals 800 milliseconds / greater than. The photograph appeared on front pages across America within days. By the end of the week, it had been reproduced more than any image in history to that point. The Office of War Information recognized immediately what they had. Not just a news photograph, but an icon. A distillation of national will into a single image. They had a problem. 3 of the 6 men in the photograph were already dead. Sergeant Michael Strank, the one who had carried the flag up the mountain, was killed by a mortar round on March 1st. He was 25. Corporal Harlon Block died the same day, hit by the same barrage. He was 21. And his mother, back in Texas, would spend years insisting it was her son in the photograph, not the man the government initially identified. She was right. Franklin Sousley, the youngest of them at 19, from Hilltop, Kentucky, was killed by a sniper on March 21st, 2 weeks before the island was declared secure. The 3 survivors, Gagnon, Hayes, and Bradley, were pulled from the fighting and brought home. The government had a war bond drive to run. Ira Hayes was a Pima Indian. Time equals 3 milliseconds greater than from the Gila River Reservation in Arizona. He had enlisted at 17. He had watched his friends die in ways no photograph could capture. Now he was being asked to shake hands with President Roosevelt, to smile for cameras, to represent something he understood only as luck and survivor's guilt. Hayes told anyone who would listen that he didn't deserve the attention. "How can I feel like a hero," he reportedly said, "when only 5 men who were with me have been killed already?" The reporters wrote around his discomfort. The Bond tour needed him, functional and photogenic. After the war, Hayes struggled. He returned to the reservation and found a country that had celebrated his image while doing little for his community. He was arrested dozens of times for public intoxication. On January 24, 1955, 10 years after Suribachi, he was found dead in a field near his home. He was 32. The Johnny Cash song that would eventually memorialize him called him the man who was too proud to cry. The reality was considerably more complicated than that. The flag going up on Suribachi didn't end the battle. In some ways, it prolonged the resistance. The Japanese commanders read it as a signal that their own defeat was imminent and fought with a ferocity that recognized nothing left to lose. The island wasn't declared secure until March 26th, 5 weeks after the landing. Of the 70,000 Marines who fought on Iwo Jima, nearly 7,000 were killed and 19,000 more were wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 survived to be taken prisoner. The fighting was so close and so sustained that 27 Medals of Honor were awarded, more than in any other single operation in American history. General Holland Smith called it the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps history. Admiral Chester Nimitz, surveying the dead, said something that has never quite been improved upon. Among the Americans who served on Iwo Jima, uncommon valor was a common virtue. The photograph won Joe Rosenthal the Pulitzer Prize. The image became the model for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, Virginia, a 100-ton bronze sculpture dedicated in 1954, where the men are frozen forever in that moment of shared effort, their faces still turned away from us, still reaching. Rosenthal spent decades explaining that he had not staged it. The question bothered him more than people understood, not because he was defensive, but because the accusation misunderstood what made the photograph true. It was true precisely because it was unstaged. 6 men were simply doing what the moment required. The camera happened to be there. He died in 2006 at 94. He had made one photograph that everyone knew, and he was fine with that. If you visit Iwo Jima today, now called Iwo-to, the Japanese pronunciation, returned to Japan in 1968, you'll find a monument near the summit of Suribachi. The island is a Japanese self-defense force base. Most tourists never get there. The volcanic rock is still black. The sulfur smell is still there. The wind off the Pacific still hits you before anything else. Somewhere below the surface, the tunnels that Kuribayashi built are still intact, collapsed in places, open in others. The bones of thousands of soldiers, American and Japanese both, have never been recovered. The island holds them still. What Strank and his men raised on that summit was a piece of cloth. What it became was something else. An argument, in fabric and light, that the effort was worth something, that the reaching mattered. Whether that argument was true is something each generation gets to decide for itself. The photograph doesn't answer the question, it just keeps asking it.